Good morning. And thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me today. I'm really excited to be part of this fantastic symposium. Over the second half of the 18th century, a particular mode and style of dress was not only popular, but also came to embody the spirit of the British gentleman. Away from the glittering, heavily embroidered and spangled silks of court and the politics and pleasures of the London season, the 18th century British gentleman was depicted at his ease and in his element in the countryside. At his country seat for the spring and summer months, a man of leisure, in addition to dealing with estate business, enjoyed his time fishing, shooting, walking, coursing, and riding. The attire donned for this country life consisted of an unembellished but smartly tailored frock coat, waistcoat, matching wool or buckskin breeches, and was accented subtly with fresh stockings, linen, and the shine of brass buttons. The look became shorthand for the English style of men's dress and was exported to the continent through the wave of what we now term Anglomania. This paper considers the construction of Britishness or Englishness through the dress, portraiture, and print culture and the exportation of Anglomania to the continent. Represented in painted portraiture and disseminated in mezzotints, etchings, and engravings, the fashionability of the English country look upset the perceived one-sided influence of French fashion coming to Britain and
Mira,
to Spain.
70
The
participantes
flow of
y somos
Anglo-styled garments
24 que
and
vamos
aesthetics
que han pedido
flourished
votar.
in the latter half of the 18th century. And this paper explores that dissemination of British styles of dress and the perception of Spanish dress in Britain through the success of painted portraiture and the revolution in print culture through the print trade. Over the second half of the 18th century, the depiction of the country gentleman was widespread. This informal fashion, worn within a country landscape setting, became an integral and arguably recognizably British style of painted portraiture, which in itself was notably British genre of painting. Over the second half of the century, innumerable portraits by artists such as Francis Hayman, Francis Wheatley, Thomas Gainsborough, Nathaniel
Claro, yo
Dance,
quiero ver
Joshua
todo
Reynolds, and
lo que
more
está pasando,
painted
que
their
lo estaba
sitters
viendo
within
con
the
los
countryside,
interiores.
often accompanied by a favorite dog, gun, or walking stick in the crook of their arm, and a hat in hand. Like these three portraits, the sitters wear plain-colored frock coats, buckskin or wool breeches, and stockinged legs or riding boots, and the typical accessories of country life. Frock coats or frocks were made of wool, linen, cotton, or fustian, depending on the season, and became increasingly less reserved for sport and more for everyday wear. As the decades progressed, gold and silver braid was replaced by the shine of brass buttons. And to the spectators on the continent, frock coats became associated with Victorian ideas of nature, simplicity, enlightenment, and democracy, and of a particularly British sensibility, practicality, and common sense. This sartorial common sense can be seen, for example, in the use of men's stockings. To suit various activities, men changed their linen, stockings, and boots rather than a full suit of clothes. As wealthy merchant Samuel Curwen noted in June 1775, quote, "For variety, I put on a clean shirt and stockings, and the lower leg was adapted in particular for country sports." Reverend James Woodford noted in October 1784 that he had purchased 2 pairs of coursing stockings made from wool from the sheep's back without ever being dressed at all and knit. To join his neighbors in coursing, which those unfamiliar with the sport of coursing is chasing game with sighthounds or lurchers. The variety of stockings available to Curwen is seen in this inventory taken in July 1782 when he traveled to London. It included 39 pairs of silk, thread, worsted, and cotton stockings of various colors and patterns, including underlying the need for choice. This variety of stockinged legs is seen in the 1769 conversation piece, William Barry introduced as heir to Wraith by Johann Zoffany. The group portrait not only depicts a gaggle of gentlemen, each sporting their country looks, but reinforces the connections between British men, their dress, and the land. The portrait is understood as a visual representation of the resolution of a messy dispute of inheritance. Here, the heir to Raith, an estate just outside Kirkcaldy, north of Edinburgh, is introduced to a group of gentlemen by his uncle William Ferguson, presumably to toast his new inheritance. Set underneath a towering oak tree, a tree often symbolic of England and Britain, this conversation piece invites us to view the simplified country dress of these men as not merely a representation of their love of country sports, but as an articulation of their connection with the land and landscape, and in turn, the British social hierarchy and empire. While not a typical representation of the Anglo look, the painting is loaded with symbolism of Britishness, including the oak tree, the mahogany table, a material representation of empire, deeds of inheritance, and even the men themselves, their legs grounded to the land like the roots of the tree beneath their feet. Despite the fact that these men are in Scotland, this portrait is a representation of British masculinity and identity. The Britishness that was portrayed in these portraits and the conversation pieces was translated onto paper through mezzotints and satirized through characters like John Bull. In portraiture's coarser cousin, graphic satire, national identity is expressed through dress was even more apparent. The sense and practicality of the Englishman was contrasted against the overwrought styles of the continent. We can see this particularly in regards to the effeminate representation of France, like politeness, circa 1779. Just as roast beef and beer is opposed with frogs and snuff, the familiar plain coat and boots of the Englishman is contrasted with the ornamental fussiness and implied effeminacy of the Frenchman's ensemble and even posture. We can see this familiar formula again in James Gilray's The Times, anno 1783. In the print, Britain is represented by the plain and stout John Bull, who mourns the loss of the American colonies. Britain is accompanied by personifications of France, Spain, and Holland. France is again the snuff-taking fop in the center, who patronizingly offers some snuff in consolidation to England. Spain is portrayed in the style of the Spanish Golden Age of the century prior, represented with a long sword and Van Dyke dress, here specifically referencing Don Juan Lagara, admiral of the Spanish fleet. Don Lagara accuses Britain of making him the laughingstock of Europe, pointing to the burning ships in the background and the failed siege of Gibraltar, which is depicted just over his shoulder. And Holland, echoing to the perceived sideline role in European politics and imperial power, is now portrayed as a dumpy burgher in ill-fitting breeches and hat at the edge of the print. In British satirical prints, just as the fop represents France, the portrayal of Spain is uniformly represented by the figure of the dawn of the 17th century Golden Age, no matter whether a political, military, or coy context. In this print from the 1780s, titled Spanish Man of War, an Englishwoman accompanies a Spanish sailor from his ship at the dock. However, unlike many other related images of foreign sailors seeking British companionship, a popular trope in print culture, here the sailor is again dressed in Van Dyke dress, complete with lace collar, sword, shoe roses, cape, and a feathered hat. Even though the title inscription of this print has been cut off, we know through his clothing and appearance that he is without a doubt Spanish. This characteristically Spanish look occurred not only in prints, but as Aileen's paper discussed this morning, was reinforced in masquerade dress, becoming synonymous with Van Dyke dress. For example, the Marquis of Rockingham ordered a very fine and incredibly expensive suit in Van Dyke dress to appear as a Spaniard at a masquerade. While this outdated look, one loaded with anti-Spanish sentiments of a failed empire, remained largely confined within British society as a stereotype in satire and at the masquerade, the Anglo look was much more successfully disseminated across the continent. The French adoption of all things Anglo, and the phenomenon which has been characterized by Anglomania, has been widely explored by historians, including our keynote, Aileen Ribeiro, as well as Kimberly Chrisman Campbell, Ian Baruma, and others. And the Spanish adoption of English styles has been established in the work of Riva Wolf, and more recently, Leticia, Villamediana Gonzalez. English culture was spread firsthand through English visitors of the Grand Tour, an expected all-encompassing finale of British education. Just as in Britain, continental satirical prints were quick to point out the regional differences and sartorial tensions for comic effect. For example, The Englishman in Paris is an entire trope of French satires. Continental artists and writers such as Goethe used the dress of the English countryman in their work, further reinforcing the association of a particularly British aesthetic, spreading the look of the English gentleman far from the boundaries of their country estates. But in addition to British tourists, English culture was disseminated through literature, periodicals, and visually through prints. This later course of dissemination is particularly significant for British culture's popularity in Spain, which, unlike France, Germany, or Italy, was unfrequented by grand tour tourists. Images of British life were captured, engraved, printed, and published in an ever-growing market, one that alongside budding industrialization and consumption can be considered another of the so-called domestic revolutions of the latter 18th century. While portraits could be viewed by some in situ at great British houses, through their display in artist studios, and through their exhibition at the Royal Academy, these images had the most geographical and social reach through their printed versions. Mezzotins of popular portraits were published alongside British landscapes and scenes of country life. Prints could be viewed in print shop windows for free by the ambling public, or purchased and collected often in folios or albums, like those we can see held in the hands of Anthony Moore Storr, whose portrait now hangs here at the Prado. We can apply similar associations of Britishness or Englishness with satirical prints as we can with the genre of painted portraiture. The free press and lack of censorship in Britain nurtured an explosive tradition of graphic satire, founded by the so-called father of satirical prints, William Hogarth. Though initially published in the middle decades of the century, Hogarth's moralizing satires continued to be published and printed for both British and European audiences. For example, in 1768, publisher Robert Serre adapted volumes of Hogarth prints for the French market with French title pages. And in Spain, Hogarth's prints were owned by Louis Pere Alcázar by 1787, and Hogarth's, as well as other British prints, were owned in the extensive collections of Sebastian Martinez, Francisco de Goya's patron, who Riva Wolf has identified as one of the potential avenues of familiarity of English satires for Goya's Capriccios. By the 1770s and 1780s, Britain's thriving print trade, which included straight as well as satirical prints, became one of the most mobile and thriving emissaries of British culture. London print sellers were actively pursuing foreign markets. At a time when oceans were more like a highway rather than a barrier for transporting goods, British prints were exported to the colonies and growing empire, appearing in Calcutta and up and down the coastal colonial United States. They were also adapted, advertised, sent, and sold for European markets. For example, Samuel William Fors advertised, quote, prints and caricatures wholesale and for exportation. And John Boydell lauded the reach and success of his print shop and business in a 1787 article in the London newspaper The World, where he boasted that, quote, Spain is beginning to deal largely in this commodity. A late order from Madrid to Messrs. Boydell exceeded £1,500 sterling. The order was sold in Madrid by bookseller Antonio Sancha. Though satirical prints can be considered a vastly different aesthetic to the idyllic country portrait, the liberty associated with the British satirical print and the print trade can be included as part of the appeal of British Enlightenment thinking and the unfussy, logical, and constitutional ethos that was so associated with British masculinity. While the British print trade and images in general were just one branch of Anglomania, accompanied and reinforced through literature, garden design, and an active export of British-made goods, we can see their influences in the Anglo look adopted in Spanish portraiture, including the work of Francisco de Goya. For example, in the portrait of the Duke of Alba, Jose Alvarez de Toledo, hanging again here at the Prado, we see numerous references to British portraiture and, by extension, the British gentleman in Anglomania. In the full-length portrait, the Duke casually rests his elbow on a very fine harpsichord or desk. I'm not a furniture historian, There are different interpretations, I apologize. On which he rests his violin while holding a sheet music of Haydn in his hands. Like many portraits in Britain, the Marquis exudes an easy cultural sophistication and implied knowledge through his stance and the objects displayed within the portrait as material signifiers. His easy posture with cross-legged ankles is reminiscent of one of the many corporeal poses frequently employed by British portraitists. Wearing a plain-colored frock coat, blue speckled waistcoat buttoned at the side in 1790s style, and bluish-gray breeches, his dress, though fine, again leans away from the heavily gilded and embellished fabrics. However, like the Zoffany group portrait discussed earlier of the heir of Wraith, one of the most distinct signs of Anglomania can again be found in the calves. Despite the interior setting of the portrait, a black hat rests in front of the violin, and black spurred riding boots encase his calves. While this detail has been attributed to his prowess as a horseman, we can simultaneously read this as a nod to the informal outdoor ease of the British gentleman and his portrayal in portraiture. Just as the frock coat extended beyond the limits of sporting activities in Britain, the look and style of the Englishman's dress and portraiture extended beyond the geographical limits of Britain. By considering the sartorial and visual representations and perceptions of British and Spanish national identity and constructions of masculinity, this paper has traced the reach of the Anglo countryside look of the British gentry and aristocracy. It has considered the broad range and adoption of the fashion for Anglomania and, potentially more importantly, the avenues of its dissemination. In particular, it has considered the role of painted portraiture and print culture in Britain's successful exportation of its effective brand identity. Framed as a practical, rational, natural, and enlightened type of gentleman, the style of British or English men dressed in a simple frock coat, buckskin breeches, and riding boots became one of Britain's most successful ambassadors of British culture of the late 18th century. Thank you very much.